everybody, how are you doing today? My name is Brill. I'm the children's librarian. I'm used to, when I greet large groups, making them sing hello with me, so I am struggling against my instincts right now. And I hope you guys are grateful for that. I read The Birds That Audubon Missed for Book Sandwiched In. It is by Kenn Kaufman, and I hope that you enjoy my presentation. So why did I read this book, and why should maybe you? So I picked this book because I love biology, history, and drama that doesn't affect me. This book promised all three. I also was attempting to buddy read with a friend who did not in fact read the book. She picked it up, she read a couple chapters, and when I called her last night to be like, can you listen to me run through this presentation? I'm freaking out a little bit. She did not answer me until 1 in the morning, and she said, I read half of it. So you guys are getting the raw and unvarnished presentation. So I'm not a big birder. I can identify a few to some degree, certainly. I got the red-winged blackbird on lock. But a lot of what this book covers is birds that were mistaken for each other or hard to identify in general. I like to call them little brown jobbies. And you can see a little brown jobby right there. So that is the Lincoln sparrow. The picture is obviously a more modern picture. The illustration is from Audubon, and he was the one who first identified it in the summer of 1833. Now, ooh, no, my presentation. Raw and unvarnished. Alright, this on the left is illustrations by Kenn Kaufman, who is the author of this book. So when he's talking about illustrating birds in the style of Audubon, he doesn't generally do the style of Audubon. These are more of his normal style. I think he's a very beautiful illustrator. He's written 13 books about birds and nature, including a series of bird guides. You'll see a picture of those later. He is an editor and consultant for the National Audubon Society. He knows his birds. So, we're starting with our cast of characters. It's a small cast. We're only talking about 3 of them. This is Alexander Wilson. He is a predecessor to Audubon. This is my favorite part. He was a Scottish satirical poet who had to flee the UK because he kept writing such mean poems that he got sued. He was trying to blackmail a guy with a poem. He kept getting sued for libel because he just could not. He was a good poet, apparently, but did he have great judgment? So when he got to America, he got into birds. He hadn't been into birds back when he was in the UK. And he created the 9-volume American Ornithology. He described 268 species of birds, 26 of which were his own discoveries. They were newly described to science. He met Audubon once when he was trying to sell a subscription to American Ornithology. Audubon did not buy a copy. Alexander Wilson's Journal of the Day says that everyone in that town was rude. But this was likely the first time that Audubon saw bird illustration as a potential life path. Wilson did die at 47 in poverty, so it wasn't a great life path, but it was a path. Audubon was obsessed with Alexander Wilson. He chose to announce that Birds of America, his ornithology series, would have more birds than American Ornithology, and in every single edition of every single book Audubon put out, he made at least one jab at Wilson, which I think is pretty funny. John James Audubon. I previously knew absolutely nothing about this guy, except that he existed and that I followed the Audubon Society on Instagram to see pictures of birds. And the first thing I learned about him is a controversial figure. He was a liar and a fraud, and he stole credit for several bird identifications, and he made up birds. When he was having trouble filling out Birds of America. And the new birds that no one else had ever seen would always drop right when he needed a sales push. He's also a somewhat mysterious figure because he lied a lot in letters, he lied a lot in his journals, and he lied a lot in his published works. And then his granddaughter was his biographer, and she destroyed a lot of his journals to maintain the image of her grandfather. So, pretty interesting guy. Obviously, he had a huge impact on naturalism and science. Like, he was a mixed bag of a person. Sounds deeply unpleasant to be around. I love his illustrations. And this is Kenn Kaufman. So, that obviously is one of his paintings, and then the field guide that he produced. Like I said, he wrote 13 books about birds and nature, editor and consultant for National Audubon Society, had his own series of bird guides. He's someone who dealt with Audubon fairly consistently over the course of his career. I would have strong opinions about this guy too if I had to deal with him so much. He wrote this book because he was bored during a COVID lockdown and he needed a project to keep him busy. He chose this as something that would get him outside, he could stay away from people, and he could think deeply. His approach to the art, because the whole point of this to him was to mimic Audubon's style for birds that Audubon did not identify, that he could have. So there are birds that were in Audubon's region that he didn't see for whatever reason. So to recreate Audubon's methods and style, he used as similar materials as he could find. He did consider doing it digitally at first, but he admits that he is just not that good of a digital illustrator. So he decided to instead make the artistic decision to stick as close to the old methods as possible. So there's a lot of differences in naturalism as a field of study between the 1800s and today. For one, we don't kill the birds that we're trying to look at as much anymore. And the bird populations are very different. I had not realized how much more biodiversity there was when Audubon was around. There's a whole chapter of the book that just talks about you would see thousands of birds almost every day. Like, you would see flocks and so many birds. Like, he was talking specifically about the ivory-billed woodpecker, which is considered fairly extinct. No one's seen one in at least 50 years, but we don't want to pull the trigger and call it extinct. People would see hundreds every day. You would see hundreds in the same tree. That's a huge difference in biodiversity. So he talks some about those changes in naturalism. So, I think that the fun parts are that Audubon was a character. I think naturalism's really cool, but it was like, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, it was a little inside baseball for me when it was talking about birding techniques. I was like, I don't do that. I don't know what you're talking about. But I do love a fraudster that doesn't affect me. So Audubon was always searching for birds to the extent that he made some up. So what we see right up here is the bird of Washington, which was his most famous fraud, which he never retracted. Some of them he was like, oh yeah, I definitely misidentified that bird and it was actually this bird. This one he claimed was real until he died. Generously, if we are giving him the utmost benefit of the doubt, it could have been a juvenile bald eagle or a real bird that no one else saw that went extinct immediately after. However, yeah, we're being pretty generous. However, Kenn Kaufman leans towards deliberate plagiarism given the similarities to the illustration of the golden eagle in the Cyclopedia. So if we're looking at these guys, this is the Audubon illustration, this is the Cyclopedia illustration, and this is the engraving that was made from that illustration for the American release. So especially in the feet, it's like the exact same thing. It's the exact same pose. Like, he made a few changes, but Like, I think we can all look at that and say, yeah, that's pretty darn similar. So, if he's missing so many birds, why did he make them up? I think that's a fun question. So, there are a couple reasons for that. There were the limitations of the equipment. They didn't have good binoculars back then. So, like, I know when I'm looking at hawks flying over the highway, I'm like, probably that's a red-tailed hawk. I don't know that much about birds, and it's pretty far up there. That's what they were doing all the time, unless they could shoot the bird and look at it closely. Limitations of equipment, one reason they missed a lot of birds. Another reason, similarity in appearance to other species. So we see that with a lot of the warblers, the ground birds, thrushes. I run out of birds pretty quickly because I'm not a bird person. And then camouflage or shy behavior. So Kenn Kaufman talked a lot about ground birds who hide in thickets, for example. And then because he was always feuding with other ornithologists and they were always trying to be the first to find a new bird, there was a lot of pressure to do things quickly rather than necessarily do them right. I think that's a pretty fun part of the book. Personally, I wish it made up a bigger part of the book. But one thing that did make up a pretty big part of the book that I thought was very interesting was the artistic process. So Kenn Kaufman talks about what Audubon did, and he also has interludes between most chapters talking about how he approached the artistic process and how he was trying to replicate it. So in this picture, we are seeing the Key West quail dove by Audubon on the right, and then a picture of the actual Key West quail dove on the left. If Google didn't lie to me, because they don't look the same to me. So Audubon was really groundbreaking in a lot of ways, and that's part of why he became such a famous illustrator. One of the things he did was the life-size depictions. So he used double elephant sheets so that he could fit the largest birds on them. And even then, the super big birds had to be cramped, like the flamingo that we saw on an earlier slide. He also, to make sure that he was getting the most accurate depictions of the birds, would take freshly killed birds and hang them with wire in the poses that he wanted when their bodies were still like soft. It's a little gory, sorry. And then he used mixed media, primarily watercolor. He outsourced the engraving for the plates for the printing. He was also one of the first to do actual backgrounds. So previous ornithologists really didn't do complex backgrounds. Sometimes when Audubon was putting out a lot of birds, he would leave the engravers to do the backgrounds, which I'm like, you should have given your engravers a raise. That's like half of the picture. But he was also one of the first people who did specific like botany in the backgrounds rather than just like random generic flowers. Like all of the flowers and plants that he painted were identifiable. So Kenn Kaufman, when he was approaching, this was his first time working at life size, which he said that actually the hardest part was not the big birds, it was the little birds, because he was used to working at 2 times size when he's painting like a little finch. But when you're working at life size, it gets a lot harder, and he had to leave out some details that he otherwise would have put in. He talked about having to restart a few paintings 3 or more times. I was just like, wow, you were really bored over lockdown. He also had not previously done much botanical illustration, and he was very nervous about doing that, which I thought was a very interesting thing, because I'm not an artist. I can't draw much of anything. So when I see people who can draw, I'm like, yeah, they can draw. Probably everything is the same level of difficulty for them. He's, no, I know birds. I do not know plants. So, right here is one of the birds that Audubon did not identify. This is the Kirtland's warbler. It was identified 4 months after Audubon's death. it has, and the reason for that, because it lived primarily in Ohio, where Audubon was, is that it has really narrow habitat requirements and was genuinely rare. This one was a hard one to find. So it was highlighted in the book as being primarily a conservation success story. It nearly went extinct in the 70s. There were only about 350 individuals in 1974. There's over 5,000 or 4,000 today. And they did that because they preserved the breeding grounds, which are young jack pines, and controlling the parasitic cowbirds, which would do the thing where they lay the egg in the nest and the cuckoo thing. So one of the notes that Kaufman made about this was that when he was illustrating it, he really wanted to put it on jack pines because they're so intertwined. They're a symbiotic relationship, but he decided not to do that because Audubon would not have known about the connection even if he had known about the bird. The connection was not made clear until like the 1870s. So part of the reason that, other than it being a genuinely rare, warblers and small songbirds were especially tricky. Oh my goodness. I haven't had a movement break. I haven't made you guys jump up and shake and turn around in circles, and I'm tripping over my tongue. I didn't know that was so much for me. So warblers and small songbirds were especially tricky because there's a lot of them. They move really fast, and a lot of them look fairly similar to each other. Another interesting note to me was also that families and genus have shifted significantly over the past 200 years. So almost every single bird in this book has had a change in its Latin name, often in its common name as well. So all of these naturalists were competing so hard to be the ones to name these new species. And it didn't stick around. But so that naming energy came from the introduction of the Linnaean system. And that has just developed so much since it was, I didn't put my notes down about this, so this is off the top of my head, and I apologize if I get any of my Linnaeus knowledge wrong. Feel free to shout out and correct me. So the Linnaeans Linnaeus created the binomial naming system in Latin, so where it's family, genus, species, but they didn't have families yet. They just had genuses, so they would put so many unrelated birds in the same genus. So over the past 100 years, it's been a lot, especially as we start to have DNA and the ability to really look at what the relationships are between birds. We've actually managed to go through and make sure that the families are actually families. They are actually closely related. But everyone was trying to be the one to name it. And they would generally either name it after the location where it was found, a person who was giving them a lot of money, or themselves. So, my verdict on this book was that it was really interesting. I learned a ton. I could not have told you any of these things about birds before I read this book. I could have told you the red-winged blackbird, but I did find it dry, which was a little unexpected to me because so much of the advertising for it focuses on the fisticuffs between naturalists, the feuding for knowledge, the feuding for money, the feuding for subscribers, and that was really truly not a heavy part of it. Like, obviously it shows up, but mostly it is about birds, it's about conservation, it's about art, and it is inside baseball. He thinks he is talking to birders. This was not the book to introduce myself to birding culture with. Maybe third or fourth. Need to work up to it a little bit. So some things that he talked about, probably, if you're a big birder, if you've looked through a field guide in the past 5 years, which I have not, if you're my mother and you have the Cornell bird identification app on your phone, if you have one of those bird buddy bird feeders that sends you pictures when your birds come visit you. Probably a lot of what he talks about would have more emotional impact than it did for me, because I'm just like, I see crows sometimes. There's sparrows. I like a blue jay. I like a bird with an ugly voice. It charms me. But it is impeccably researched and very straightforward. So I would highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this topic. Like, it's so detailed, so well researched, and part of what really drove that home for me was when I was putting this slideshow together and I did not take notes while I was reading because I'm a fool who thinks my memory is better than it is. I would look at the Wikipedia page for Alexander Wilson while I'm getting the picture and be like, am I remembering these things correctly? And I'm like, that is not that much information. I have to go flip back through this book and find what Kaufman actually said. And he also clearly keeps up with any developments in birding and birding culture, because he was talking about a piece of research that came out in the late teens that was fairly impactful for their understanding of Audubon's frogs. So he is up to date with what he's talking about. He knows what he's talking about. He expects you to know a little bit about what he's talking about. And if you don't, you're just along for the ride. I was along for the ride. So it had a lot to say about the difficulties of identification, which really helped me understand how we're still discovering new species when, you think of this world as being pretty well understood. But then I look at, I'm mildly making up a number, but not 100% making it up. We've got 400,000 species of beetles we know about, and there's at least 200,000 more we don't. And I'm like, how do we know that? This book helped me understand that. So the art on this page is, the Birds in Art 2020 is Kenn Kaufman. It's a snowy egret, and that's his natural style. That is the style he goes for. So you can see that he doesn't really do many plants on the background. He really likes wading birds and water. And then the Great White Heron by Audubon, which obviously has aged a bit since it came out in the 1800s. These are the thick-billed long spurs by Kenn Kaufman, which is another type of sparrow that kind of just got grouped in with other sparrows. Like, I would call this a chickadee, I don't know. I'm not a bird person. So that is what I have prepared for you guys. Do you guys have any questions for me, thoughts? Yes?
I'm curious about the writing style. Did you find it accessible?
So it's definitely dense, but he's trying to be accessible, and he's having a little bit of fun with it. So, the introduction, he starts off, in a narrative nonfiction style where it goes really over the top, and then he immediately drops that to be, very straightforward and, this is what happened. So I found it pretty accessible. It was just, there's a lot going on, and when every sentence was new information for me, it took me a while to get through. So it took me a lot longer to read than other books that I've read that have been relatively equivalent. Yes?
I bet you'll never look at birds again in the same way you did before.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's important to challenge ourselves to something that you don't think you particularly choose, but then you find out there are some parts of it that are really fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the books that I'm thinking about in comparison to this book is, I don't remember the exact title, but it's The Girl Who Drew Butterflies or something, and it's about Maria Sibylla Merian, who was the first entomologist, basically. So in the 1600s, she was a girl and then a woman who just was really interested in bugs. She was the one who started looking at the world around her in the way that led to illustrations like this. And I do like bugs. When I was a child, I was obsessed with bugs. I still am a little bit. I like a beetle. They're shiny, they're fun. And the world is just so much more interesting when you know what you're looking at and when you're curious about what you're looking at. I saw him.
Is this Kern's first book that he's written?
It might be the first book like this. He had produced the Bird Guide series, and he wrote a novel, which he does not talk about in this at all, but when I was looking up author information for the presentation, it's apparently a cult classic. I haven't heard of it, I'm not in the cult, but he sounds like he's had a very interesting life. He started hitchhiking around the country as a teen to go birding. He has a story about hitchhiking through Florida and getting picked up by some people who were like, maybe robbing gas stations, but they gave him a ride and they let him out, so it was all good. He's like, didn't die, I saw some cool birds, I ended up in New Orleans. So he's an interesting character. Yes.
I listened to it through Audible in the jigsaw puzzle. That's a good combination because it is a little dry, so you can focus on something else at the same time. But listening to it was interesting. It's not read by him actually, it's read by someone else. And then I just looked at the book to see the illustrations, but I'd recommend that way to do it because there's a lot of interesting information. You just have that parts of it you can zone out a little bit and come back in.
Yeah, part of the reason that I picked to read it in hard copy, one was because we did not own it on Libby in audiobook, and I'm cheap and don't like spending money when I don't have to. And two, because I wanted to see the pictures, and they are very pretty. So I grabbed a few of them to put in this presentation, but there's tons that I did not grab, both of Audubon's and Kenn Kaufman's. So I highly recommend at least just flipping through it and looking at the pictures, even if you're like, I'm not that interested, you know.
It's on here first, because I believe the last one is that Letters from Yellowstone.
Yes,
And I happened to see that, and I had no idea what it was. So I picked it up and took it home, and it is a story told through letters, but the main character is a grad student from Cornell back in the 1890s.
Oh, wow.
Who goes out to Yellowstone for a summer intern program. And she's a botanist, but there's also a lot of Latin names, and she sees birds. And that one was very readable. It's told, this is an independent female who's before the women's suffrage bill was passed. And so there's that, and there's a sort of a really low-key possible romantic story, but there's a lot of science.
That sounds really awesome.
So if somebody's looking for something else to read, I didn't see it out there right now, but I know that there was a copy borrowed from, it's a 1999 book, so it's not a new book, but it's a borrowed copy from Palmyra that we can.
I had a friend who just went to Yellowstone to see the wolves, and the friend that I was talking about who didn't read this book with me, actually, she was in Yellowstone, so I guess that's an excuse. She's seeing wolves, whatever. I'm not more important. But Letters from Yellowstone was one of the books that their guide recommended really highly. So when I saw that on the book sandwiched in list, I was like, awesome. Like,
But you haven't read it.
I haven't read it yet. I've been really focused on this one.
Yeah. It sounds like this was a chore, good for you.
A little bit, yeah. If I had not declared I was going to do it, I probably would have dropped it and then come back to it at a different time period, possibly over the course of a year. Like,
Why did you pick it? Because of your mother's interest in birds?
oh no, my mom is not good at bird identification.
Oh,
She just
okay.
got the Cornell lab thing because she's not good at it and she wanted a computer to tell her what she was hearing. No, I picked it because I'm trying to read more new releases this year, and this one's a much more recent book than what I normally read. And I thought it sounded interesting, and my friend who I buddy read with gave me a list of 3 books that she was interested in, and I was like, that one sounds like one I could give a talk about to a group of people I don't know. Yes.
Throws in a lot of interesting tidbits. I'm only up to chapter 3, but he talks about, we assume Carlos Linnaeus is the man that did all this, but he talks about the indigenous peoples all over the world that have done this for eons, and they had a whole system. And of course, as white people, we wouldn't accept, so we had to go with a Swede. But things like that I find fascinating. That's where he sneaks in little tidbits here and there.
That's also in Yellowstone.
Is it? Yeah, yeah.
Native Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah, he continues talking about indigenous interactions with nature and like methods of knowledge throughout the book, which is very interesting, especially when he's talking about like environmental impact, because like obviously when the first Americans came over here, they wiped out the megafauna. We don't have mammoths because they were easy eating, but the amount of birds were so much higher than in Europe. So it was like that type of living with and around nature without being like, they were still hunting, like they were still impacting nature, but they were living with it in a much more sustainable way than we currently are. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious, you mentioned backgrounds, that's what you notice a lot of times when you see them. Are those true? Did you learn anything about, are those the actual plants and habitats where those birds would be? Because some of them look very, almost orchids and things, and maybe at the time that was the habitat. But
Sometimes, but often he really just went for what would be pretty. He liked pretty. I understand, I also like pretty. Yes, Karen.
So did you have a favorite type of bird like before you started reading the book, and now do you have the same favorite bird or something different?
I am a big sucker for a snowy egret. I have periodically worked at a paddling place over the summer where we see a lot of snowy egrets, herons, and red-winged blackbirds, so I have a real soft spot for all of those. I also really like a cormorant, but it's hard to love them too much because they have really gnarly poop. They will kill trees. They will all sit in a tree and then they will all poop on the tree and then the tree dies. It depends on the time of year, because they migrate through here, and sometimes that's normal, but sometimes they stay when they're not supposed to, and then they're harmful, and the amounts are pretty rough. Yes?
What's your next project?
My kiddos have picked a book for book club that is called Ari and Dan Break the Universe. So that's the next one I know that I'm going to be reading. Am I excited about it? It's for the kids. They knew me. They were like, we don't want to read that one. We want to read this one. Okay, if you're reading, I like it. I generally try to read poetry in the like winter months when my attention span is really bad. So I'm probably going to go through a few books of poetry. If anyone's got any recommendations, toss them my way. All right.